Hello and welcome to NCGPA Live, informative conversations about general practice in Nottingham City. I'm Dr. Andy Foster. I'm joined by Dr. Jane Turrill today, who is clinical lead at NCGPA for SMD and also a retired GP. But hello, Jane.
Hello, Andy.
Good. So today we're going to be talking about the work being done across Nottingham City to support patients who are experiencing severe multiple disadvantage. This is part one of two conversations. In this first part, we'll define SMD, talk about some of the work that's already underway in Nottingham. And in part two, we'll be looking to the future, so the future plans in Nottingham for dealing with SMD and how that links into national and local strategies, amongst other things. NCGPA is a federation with over 40 GP member practices in Nottingham City, and we hope that these NCGPA Live conversations will be of interest to local practices and others working in who are interested in primary care networks, GP federations, and the NHS beyond. And we hope that you will find this interesting and helpful. We're aiming to have a fairly free-flowing, structured conversation on this topic, which we hope you will find entertaining as well as informative. So yeah, sit back, continue jogging, do your ironing, drive your car, and listen to us talk about SMD. So Jane, do you want to just sort of introduce yourself briefly to the audience?
Well, yes, I'm a retired GP from clinical practice, but I have continued working in service development since I retired about 3 years ago. Originally, I worked in different fields of general practice. I was a partner for some years and then left general practice to work in occupational health, almost exclusively for Marks and Spencer's, which I did for 15 years, 10 years outside of general practice. And then on returning, I worked in a very wide variety of practices before ending up at Platform 1 practice in Nottingham, which was, these were all salaried roles, which was a APMS practice commissioned about 12, 13 years ago, purely to serve inner city patients who found it difficult to access traditional general practice. And out of that, my interest in SMD grew. And then when for various reasons Platform 1 was no more, I continued working with NCGPA to develop their response to SMD.
So interesting story, yeah. And so Jane, you didn't start out your career working with SMD patients. So was that a conscious decision, or is it just how things evolved? Just interested to know how you came to be involved in that area.
Yeah, it's really very much an evolution, and if you like, a realization of sort of patients' needs. The first practice I worked in had a very high number of elderly patients and was positioned very close to the teaching hospitals with a lot of sheltered and single-storey accommodation. So we had a very high number of patients with long-term conditions and physical disabilities, mental disabilities. So again, it wasn't what we would traditionally call now an SMD practice, but it was patients with huge numbers of complexities and challenges and quite a degree of health inequalities. And then I think after that, working in occupational health, I got a much wider appreciation of the impact of health on work, particularly mental health, and really through that developed an enduring interest in mental health. And then from then, when I worked in a succession of different practices in many different parts of the county and city, you could see that the sort of health inequalities and complexities manifested themselves in very, very different ways, but with an underlying problem of patients having difficulty in accessing the type of general practice and care, that primary care that most patients sort of took for granted, as it were, back in those days. And I think now, having worked in the APMS practice with a very different group of patients, we quickly evolved into a practice with almost just over 11,000 patients, with but mainly younger, much younger patients. We only had 200 patients over 65, but the impact of what has become recognised as severe multiple disadvantage was very strong, particularly around mental health issues. And I think sort of my interest in how we can support practices and the workforce more widely, particularly now across the PCN, to have a better understanding of how a sort of trauma-informed response can help not only the patients, but also the staff as well.
Good, very interesting story there. And you're just leading us into actually sort of defining SMD and so forth, which we'll get into in a second. But first, I shall just introduce myself so people are aware of my interests. So I'm Dr. Andy Foster. I'm a GP partner actually within Nottingham City. I sit on the NCGPA board, so the organisation that produces this podcast and vlog. I'm the inequalities lead for my local primary care network in Bulwell and Top Valley, and I'm the deputy inequalities lead for the place-based partnership. So I've also got an interest in inequality and SMD, and we can talk about how those two interplay a little bit later, I guess. But first, we'll probably get to the stage where we need to define what we mean by significant multiple disadvantage. So do you want to help us with that, Jane? And I'll just bring some slides onto screen, which might help.
Yes. Severe multiple disadvantage sort of has evolved as a way of defining those people who are most really disadvantaged within the health system and beyond, in other statutory services, and also in the voluntary sector. It's at the moment the definition is taken as somebody suffering two or three of the following of the disadvantage that's just shown there on the screen. Homelessness or includes being vulnerably housed, so people who are in any sort of hostel or temporary accommodation, or who are sofa surfing. Substance misuse obviously includes both misuse of drugs and alcohol, but also prescription medicines. Mental ill health is generally in the higher ends taken to be a mental health problem which would suggest that somebody would need referring to secondary care. It doesn't necessarily mean they have, because as all of us know, for the most chaotic patients, actually accessing secondary services can be really challenging, but it is generally deemed to be mental health issues at that level, but also including things like personality disorder. Victim of domestic violence and sexual abuse is a more recent addition to that, the sort of panoply of disadvantage. And involvement in the criminal justice system is broadly taken as obviously a disadvantage. This poses slight problems when we're looking at this in the health sector, because we don't record involvement in the criminal justice system routinely, or indeed it's avoided to be recorded or coded in health notes. So this can actually, we tend in health circles not to make that a sort of necessity and have a slightly looser definition. As the slide shows, Nottingham has the 8th highest prevalence nationally, and has been involved in several national government initiatives around the problems of SMD in the Fulfilling Lives programme. I think one important thing to say at this time is that almost somewhere around 85 to 95% of patients suffering severe multiple disadvantage have frequent occurrence of adverse childhood experiences, which I think most of us who've who've had contact with patients in surgery and been through their stories would recognise that as a very common theme.
I'm just seeing 85% figure attached to adverse childhood experiences. So does that mean that 85% of those defined as SMD have had a significant adverse childhood experience? Wow, that is really high, isn't it? Jane, I suppose these things are always evolving in terms of our understanding and how we define things. I was just wondering if you think that, is there anything missing there that you might think warrants being included in that definition of severe multiple disadvantage? I'm thinking about perhaps language barriers, and some of our practices in the city have high proportions of patients with English not as their first language, and that puts them at a disadvantage in accessing services, for example. But is there anything that you feel could be included, maybe?
Absolutely. I think the work in this field is evolving rapidly, and I think it will absolutely be the case that the definition will broaden. The early work on people with very sort of high levels of disadvantage using these definitions resulted in a relatively racially and gender specific group of people accessing services. And I think in order to, there's a lot of work going on at the moment, both nationally and a huge amount across the city, to look at how we can broaden the access to services for those from BAME communities, from other underrepresented groups, and it specifically also women were highly underrepresented. And I think it's recognised that the sort of standard definition of homelessness would actually exclude a lot of women who are homeless, but actually don't emerge into the system by being visible on the streets. So there's an awful lot of, and the same is true of BAME communities, in that the sort of homelessness and being vulnerably housed can be very much hidden from view. And there's a lot of work going on at the moment in the city to identify better ways of access, allowing patients to be identified and to access care.
And another thing that I've noticed recently is we're talking a lot more about inequality, and it appears in a lot of strategic documents. There's a lot of national and local conversation around inequality. I was just wondering if you felt there were similarities between inequality and SMD, and also where there might be, differences and lines that we need to maintain between the two. What's your feeling on that topic, Jane?
Well, I think actually there's a huge synergy between the two topics, and the more I've been working on this over the past sort of 6 to 9 months, I think there's probably a real intersection that I'm hoping in the next 6 months or so with yourself and various other people in the city to explore, particularly when we're looking at primary care, because I think very much in this field of severe multiple disadvantage, there are a lot of high-end services who are looking at people with very, very, very severe and complex problems. I think as we move forward, we need to look at prevention and early intervention, which naturally brings us to general practice and primary care and work across the PCNs more broadly. And I think then, the more, as I've been working on that, the synergy with the health inequalities work is huge, and I think we probably are working in parallel at the moment, but I think there is a huge need for us to actually come together, and really they're two sides of the same coin.
Absolutely. And I'm just thinking a lot of the listeners and viewers out there will be sat within practices within the city or elsewhere. They won't be part of, they may not be part of these sort of specialist outreach services that have traditionally dealt with a lot of SMD. Just wondering what can normal practices do to support their patients with SMD? You know, when they see them, when they recognize them, what are the practical things that they can do, or how can they structure their services to make sure they're welcoming to these people?
Yes, I think it would be helpful here to talk a little bit about the SMD local enhanced service that was introduced across the city and county in Nottingham. This came about, probably to give a little bit more background, during COVID, in order to help with the issues of caring for the homeless community during the initial stages of the COVID crisis. There was a national move called Everybody In, which I think people will be familiar with, and there was a partnership formed very rapidly across the place, what was then the ICB, but the place-based partnership in Nottingham, involving everyone who was involved in the care of disadvantaged patients, but starting with homelessness, but broadening to include other areas as well, meeting weekly to make sure that sort of rapid, sensible and practical steps were enacted, and communication between the agencies involved in those things was as seamless and really sort of outcome focused as possible. Now that partnership has continued and has been involved. Its initial two big pieces of work were bidding for and successfully getting funding for the Changing Futures government initiative, which is focused around SMD patients and is about looking at SMD support, but also looking at the agencies who are most involved in SMD and putting workers from the Changing Futures programme embedded in those areas, and primary care is one of them, to actually support those individual areas to build on what they can do. Now, in Nottingham, our embedded Changing Futures primary care worker has already put together quite a lot of support and online directory and information, and has started delivering training to practices. And that's something that we're building on week by week at the moment. He's also doing a lot of work with the additional primary care roles around the pharmacists and social prescribers, recognising that with the difficulties in clinical recruitment and retention across well, nationally at the moment, the broader team becomes much more important in allowing a good primary care response to these issues. The other aspect of the work of the partnership was to, particularly, I think, after the sort of demise of Platform One, although it still exists in a smaller form as a much smaller practice, to actually look at how practices, as you call normal practices, could develop their understanding of SMD and develop their ability to give what we might call trauma-informed care, so flexible and non-judgmental approach to practices and how we can best support that. So the local enhanced service was devised and has really, apart from identification of patients with SMD, and the criteria in primary care in this respect is to only have 2 of the prescribed disadvantages, and indeed if somebody is homeless then they automatically qualify to benefit from the LERS. And as well as having identifying a lead in the same way as you would have a safeguarding lead within a practice, there is a move towards training for all members of the practice across both administration and all clinical roles to have training in what's known as PI and TIC, that is psychologically informed environments and trauma-informed care, which I know we'll probably get on to talk on a little bit later. But essentially that means being able to deliver care that is, as I said, flexible and non-judgmental. And in terms of the flexibility, that may mean having sort of different arrangements for allowing people to make appointments, because the classic thing that's raised by those with lived experience at the moment is that ringing at 8 o'clock in the morning is a challenge for a lot of people, but it's actually a huge challenge if you don't have a phone, if your phone's been stolen, if you are sleeping rough. Those sort of things then put immeasurable barriers in following sort of current rules for access, if you like, and often sometimes for turning up exactly on time. So having some flexibility around those things for patients who've been identified can be very helpful. And I think the embedded posts, not just in primary care, but probation services, mental health services, housing services, and social work, are working together to help get better understanding about how the systems can work better as a partnership to support people and have better communication and information sharing between there. I think that covers your question.
I think it does. Lots of information there. There's a few phrases there which I think might be interesting to just expand on a little bit. So you talked about I heard trauma-informed care and psychologically informed environments. Can you get a little bit deeper on each of those, Jane?
Yes.
So we understand a little bit more as the audience.
Fine. If you are a lot, we've already mentioned that a lot of patients who may be at the early stages of developing or being exposed to health inequalities have had adverse childhood experiences. And one of the issues that comes across, particularly when you're involving those with lived experience, is that the actual environment of healthcare premises and the way that they're structured can be not just difficult to engage with, but actually significantly re-traumatizing. And it's about looking at both the physical environment and looking at both the systems used to make sure that the system is as psychologically informed as possible, so that somebody who has been through significant trauma in the past, the third or fourth time they're asked to retell their story, they are probably going to get very distressed, and that may manifest itself in aggression or those sort of things. And actually, if you are aware of those issues and don't re-traumatize people, then they're not going to get into a position where they're becoming upset and aggressive or whatever, and you don't actually need de-escalation because you don't escalate in the first place.
Yeah, that's
really
good. Yeah, it does. That's a really good point. It just highlights for me the importance of continuity of care as well. Too often people are seeing a different person for the first time. Too often, and as medical professionals, we always feel obliged to make inquiries about the patient's background and to feel that we as an individual GP, need to understand that person's background, and that can lead to, if you're seeing different GPs, to those same questions being asked again and again. So I really get how that can be re-traumatizing. So I suppose this is a group of patients where actually making special provision for them to be able to see the same or a small group of clinicians again and again, it's really important.
I think realistically at the moment, the continuity of care has to be within a multidisciplinary team. There is not the staffing across the board at the moment for somebody to have sort of individual GP contact guaranteed, whatever. But I think this is where, again, we found at Platform One, that continuity and understanding and support can be with a healthcare assistant, who can then keep other people. It can be with one of the practice nurses, or with an advanced nurse practitioner. It can be within a lot of people, and indeed, this is probably where social prescribers and other teams, if they're used in a slightly more flexible way, could actually be a valuable member of that multidisciplinary team that wraps around the patients and supports them.
Absolutely. You touched also on changing futures. I don't know if there was anything else. Was there anything else that you wanted to say about changing futures? I know we had a few slides, and I'll just bring one of them up. Did you want to talk about the different components or threads within changing futures, and also how people can access it and what it is, in a way?
Yes, certainly. As I say, it's a combination of a service offer, an educational and workforce development and support offer, and the embedded posts, peer, as it says, peer mentors, the huge emphasis on the voice of lived experience, which I'm trying to carry forward into the work that I'm doing. And I think as well, looking at the commissioning and joint planning is a really important area, because one of the asks of the applying for the government bid for this was to look at system change. It's a relatively short programme, but at the end of it, it's hopeful that we will be in a position where the learning and support that has been put in place in various parts of the system, including primary care, is self-perpetuating, and the partnerships that have been established over the period of time of the Changing Futures programme will continue, and that partnership way of working, in the face of the health inequalities that we face, and frankly, which are probably potentially going to get quite significantly worse over the next few months with the cost of living crisis and other issues, that multidisciplinary way of working and that partnership way of working continues. There are aspects of the Changing Futures programme which offer very high-end support for individuals who score very highly on the SMD characteristics, and the multidisciplinary team looks at patients who again are presenting to many different areas of the system, but may not necessarily reach the criteria required for this sort of very intensive intervention. And I know Bobby, who is the CEO of Changing Futures, has done a podcast with you, which I just wonder if we can perhaps put a link in somewhere in the podcast to that, because he does go into a huge amount more detail about the sort of higher end of the Changing Futures programme. I think I would prefer today to focus more on the system change aspects of it, and how we can work together across the city and the county, because SMD doesn't really recognise neat barriers. I mean, one of the advantages at Platform One was that we had no boundaries, and that was hugely influential in allowing us to provide flexible care for people who might be moving between half a dozen different hostels in a year, and without that would have had to register at half a dozen different GP practices, which again makes the whole, which doesn't really work. So I think focusing on how we can actually change the system to better support practices will be really helpful. I haven't mentioned TIC, have I? No.
That's good. You've just given a good trailer there in terms of what we'll aim to focus in part 2 of this conversation, which will be more future looking, There's an idea of developing a centre of excellence for SMD within Nottingham City, which I'm really excited to hear about as well. So that's a little bit of a trailer for next time, but Tick, go ahead.
I was just going to say trauma-informed care is essentially care that recognises the difficulties of patients in accessing health and puts in care which is, as I say, flexible, non-judgmental and responsive, and recognises the difficulty of re-traumatisation.
Just speaking to you prior to the meeting and prior to this interview and also during, it feels like there's a little bit of reframing that a lot of GPs, and practice staff could do around these SMD type patients, because I think all too often they may unfortunately get labelled as people who are, they're not attending their appointments, and that's their fault. Therefore we are disappointed in them, and why should we try to be accommodating if people can't meet us halfway? There's a lot of stigma, isn't there? I mean, that's one of the big things about SMD, and I think that does map across to how practice might have historically labelled some of these patients. So there's a reframing exercise in there. I think, well, actually, there's a reason why people behave in this way, particularly when they're members of these particular categories. And actually, it's about giving them equity of access, not treating everybody the same, but treating people in a way that enables them to get the same outcome, which is access to a GP appointment or access to another service. And actually, we need to reframe how we think about these patients, and it's not their fault, it's circumstances. And so for me, that's what I took away from trauma-informed care, and I actually thought that was quite powerful, actually. So I'll be talking to my practice team, about that as well. And that's part of the training, isn't it, as well?
Yeah, we can help you do that. Yes. I think one of the things to say is as well is that a couple of little, if you like, practical examples of how it could work better is that, if a patient has an appointment, very often you get a text or something to remind you of it the day before or whatever. Doesn't work if your phone is out of, you haven't got access to charge your phone or whatever. But a lot of people will have support workers, and if instead you remind their support worker that they've got an appointment the next day, I know there's an issue around consent and that sort of thing, but that can be factored into the system. Then the support worker can help the person to attend an appointment. And I think by doing that, just thinking slightly outside the box and doing things slightly differently, that becomes much less of a problem. And indeed, I think working on the boundary issue is something that we are actively trying to look at the moment, particularly around people with prison discharges and coming out of hospital, coming out of other sort of places where people emerge from long-term care can be really challenging.
Yeah, as you say, looking at the boundary issue again, you say it almost feels like we're having to reinvent a new wheel again, and that's not always a bad thing, because sometimes the new wheel is better. But we had Platform One, didn't we, that did a lot of this specialist work, and then as Platform One was decommissioned, I guess, a lot of these patients then moved out back to their practices, which is why we're all experiencing more of these types of patients, I guess. And now we're having to think about how we change the system again to accommodate for this and support practices. It's just interesting, isn't it? The wheel just keeps turning, and we have to deal with the same problems in new and different ways.
Yeah, well, I've been around long enough to see the wheel turn quite a few times, but I think another thing that is interesting to mention is in the Health Select Committee report that was published recently, they have actually sort of re-recognised, if you like, that or started to actually identify very clearly that to allow equality of access for different groups of patients cannot all be done in the same way and for the same amount of money, and that in the system has to recognise that. which it did in platform 1, but having lost that, I think it's now being it has been recognised nationally that is an issue, and I think that's where the LES comes in, and I think that is something that we can build on significantly to support practices to do that. But it's more than actually just supporting practices to support the patients by having a psychologically informed environment and trauma-informed care, which sounds a bit sort of left field for a lot of practices. But by operating in that way, it actually makes people's work lives, so the staff benefits, are actually quite significant. And a lot of organisations outside of healthcare, when they're looking at adapting these ways of working, are actually doing it around the motivation for staff benefits, for staff wellbeing, and for staff retention and recruitment, which I think is something that we could actually consider how that can be reframed within primary care.
That's really interesting, actually, because I think about the things that cause upset for the staff that work in my practice, and it's often actually when somebody's needs aren't met, and that creates a difficult situation at the front desk or a difficult situation within a consulting room. And actually I can see that actually if staff have permission to treat certain groups or certain patients differently and make accommodations for them that they wouldn't necessarily make for for other members of the population group, that can really reduce friction and actually also probably improve their satisfaction, really, in terms of feeling that they're actually genuinely helping these people. I think sometimes our staff might feel restricted by the system, which makes them treat everybody the same, and makes them follow strict procedures and protocols, but actually allowing for some flexibility, as you say, flexible care within that for certain groups. I can see how that actually makes things easier for staff. Actually, there's an equality issue with the other patients who might not be happy that accommodations are being made for certain people. But I think we just have to balance these things and square them. In fact, what do you have any tips for that? Because some of the patients might see somebody coming up to the front desk and they get told that they can have an appointment that day, and other people not. Are there ways you've learned to square that away with other patients?
I think there are, because if within the practice you have a flexible, non-judgmental approach, I think, we found this, that you would often get comments from patients that they were very impressed with how our reception staff actually supported patients with clear difficult problems, but also I would just say I think the flexibility isn't necessary. I think this is where we can look in primary care at SMD a bit more broadly and talk about health inequalities. Because say if a young mum's got 3 children under 5, the odds on her managing to get a bus and get to her surgery within an allotted time might be quite challenging. Particularly if she's has no family support, is a single mum or whatever. I think the receptionist would probably, I hope receptionists would make allowance if she turns up a bit late for one of her child's immunisations or whatever. And that's actually making this, it's no different really in terms of the flexibility. It's being allowed to respond to people in a flexible way, and it really does help. And the patient satisfaction in the practice tends to improve. What the flip side of that is that we operated at platform 1 with a huge multidisciplinary team and were nurse-led, so that our patients were very, very much used to having their health needs met by professionals other than GP doctors. That it could be a pharmacist, and we were operating that system for years. And I think that is a way of actually meeting the needs for flexibility.
Absolutely.
Bigger issue, but I think that that is something that could be explored further.
Yeah, I think with this flexibility issue, I think often patients are more understanding than we think actually, and actually it's us that put up some of those barriers and some of those expect rigid procedures to be rigidly followed by reception and other staff, when actually we may care about more about that as organizations than the patients do, and actually they like to see people being cared for and accommodated for, and appreciate that not all difference is visible. I think patients are often a lot more understanding than we give them credit for. There are a few other things happening in Nottingham. I'm just thinking before we move on and move into the next episode. There are a few more things that are happening in Nottingham. I'm just thinking about things like the Phoenix programme and things that our colleagues might be keen for us to mention that are helping focus attention on SMD, but also inequality as well. And you've been a beneficiary, if that's the right word, of the Phoenix programme. So is it worth a mention?
Yes.
A mention of what's happened there?
Well, for some time there have been funded, supported roles for new GPs and mid-career GPs to participate to define a project and to work in a way that explores an interest of theirs in a particular aspect of the healthcare system. And recently the senior fellowship has been launched. Now, senior just means we're older, not that we're actually any more elevated. So it's for GPs towards the end of their career or immediately post-retirement from clinical practice, and it funds a period of time a week. It can be quite flexible, either from half a day or a day over a period of 3 to 6 months, or you can stretch it out a bit longer by working the hours slightly more flexibly, to look at a project, which is something that will have interested somebody for during their career, and they want to explore in more depth, and that will be of sort of benefit to the system as it is, and looking towards system change and supporting other people. So at the moment, I think there are about 7 or 8 of us. But I've got colleagues working in the field of women's health. I've got colleagues working in the field of mental health, looking at how the new primary care mental health roles can best support practice and secondary care, and looking at that intersection. There are people looking at a salaried doctor career progression and how we can better sort of enhance the lifestyle, if you like, of GPs as they move through the system. The various things, but I think I've found it hugely helpful personally to be able, because I just felt there was unfinished business, if you like, in my career, and that I wanted, I did want to work more on the service development and the SMD. It has actually completely naturally evolved over the last 2 to 3 years that I've ended up doing this. And prior to that, the SMD work was also hugely supported in the small role that I have with NCGPA as their sort of outward facing person in the SMD world in the city and beyond. But the two things are again quite closely allied. So I've been very fortunate to find that, and I'm still working. Yeah.
Yeah, I've been really impressed by the fellowship programs in Nottingham City. Actually, there's the senior fellowship program that sort of retained people like yourself and others within the system for a little bit longer after retirement, so that you can give back some of the wisdom, from your careers. As you say, often people have got that bit of unfinished business that they've not quite been able to tackle while they've been a full-time clinician, and it just gives them that space to give back, which is great. And then at the beginning of the career, I know my primary care networks benefited from some of the Trailblazer Fellows, which is a fellowship designed to encourage people to take up roles within practices in areas of high health inequality and deprivation. And that's really helpful for getting people started on a career in those areas, and often they will stay in those areas and we retain them, and it helps with some of that recruitment and retention issues. So I think all of these things in some way support the SMD and inequality agenda, so it's great to see them happening in the city. So I guess that brings us to the end of the first of our two conversations. Next time I'm looking forward to having a conversation looking a little bit more sort of into the future in terms of what's happening next in Nottingham City, some exciting things about the development of a centre of excellence for patients with SMD, which is really, really exciting, and other measures. I think we'll be talking a little bit about the Health Select Committee report and reframing how we talk about deprivation, SMD, inequality, and the practice that work in those areas. So looking forward to a really interesting conversation. But before we close, Jane, is there anything that you would ask people do, having listened to this episode? Go away, look something up, get in touch with yourself or other people, anything, any call to action?
I think I would ask people to look a little more at the any training that they have available around psychologically informed environments. I think one of the things that we learned at Platform One was that the most important people almost in the practice are the receptionists, and that supporting and training your receptionists to support patients is probably the first and most important thing that you could do. I think almost the name receptionist is completely inadequate for explaining somebody who does an amazing job, both as a navigator, as a sort of administrator, as a care support worker. They do so much work, and I think we really should look at
renaming them.
Yes.
No, I think you're right. It's nice to see that being acknowledged in some of the documents that have been coming out recently as well, and suggesting that and supporting that idea. So thanks very much. I'm also thinking, I think there's an SMD portal on TeamNet, which is our local sort of intranet within Nottingham City and a little more widely in Nottinghamshire, so people can get more information about changing futures and some of the other things that we've mentioned there as well. And I guess we will see people in the next episode. So thanks so much, Jane. And we'll all be talking again soon.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Till
Bye-bye.
next time. Bye.